Trudeau said that they would issue retaliatory tariffs against the Americans. So why is a conservative leader agreeing with basically a 25% liberal tax increase?
These tariff threats from the United States are utterly unjustified. There is no justification for what President Trump is threatening on Canada.
What is your position on the right number in terms of the levels for permanent residency?
It would be a lot more like the Harper numbers that were the same basically for 40 years. It's very simple. If you break our laws when you're here as a visitor, we kick you out. I don't know how anybody can disagree with that.
What do you think the legacy of the Freedom Convoy was?
Well, I think that
Hi, I'm Candice Malcolm, and this is the Candice Malcolm Show. We have a very special episode for you today, folks. We are in Ottawa, in studio, with none other than the leader of the opposition, Mr. Pierre Poilievre. Pierre, thank you so much for doing this.
Thank you very much for having me.
Okay, so I want to start by talking about Canada, talking about the Canada that has become over the last 9 years, specifically Justin Trudeau. So I want to ask you, Pierre, what is the worst thing that Justin Trudeau has done to Canada?
Well, he broke its promise. There was a very simple promise in Canada that you work hard, you get a great life. Doesn't matter where you come from, it matters where you're going. It doesn't matter who you knew, it matters what you can do. Your bloodlines, your birthplace, your background was irrelevant as long as you were able to put your shoulder to the wheel and contribute something. And that meant you got a nice house, you could feed your kids good, nutritious food, you'd have a powerful paycheck that you'd bring home. That promise is broken after 9 years of the Carney-Trudeau Liberals. And now I think their main objective will be to distract people, make people forget about the last 9 years, to give them another 4. The worst thing about breaking this promise is politicians break promises all the time. Usually they break their own promises, but this was not Justin Trudeau's promise to break. It was a promise that belonged to all of us. And that is why it's so tragic that he's been able to break it. But the good news is we can put the pieces back together. We need to get back to a common sense, free enterprise country with low taxes and fast permits that allows people to work hard and achieve great things and be honored as entrepreneurial heroes. That is the country that I grew up with, and that's what we're going to bring home.
So what do you think Justin Trudeau's legacy will be specifically?
I think it'll be just that. Like he promised all these wonderful things for the middle class, remember? What did he give the middle class? He doubled their housing costs. Now, there's not a single middle class youth in Canada outside of a few small number of communities where they can afford homes. If you're a middle class 25-year-old in Toronto, there's no way you can afford a house. That wasn't the case before Trudeau. People feel endangered in their streets. 50,000 people have died of drug overdoses because of radical drug liberalization. And that is the consequence of decisions made by government. The good news is because they're all self-inflicted problems, we know how to fix them. We need to reverse the decisions that caused the problems in the first place, and we can do that.
So you were one of the first people that I heard, and definitely the loudest voice, warning about what you called just inflation or the consequences of printing money.
Yes.
You came on my podcast back in 2021 and warned about it. So tell me, Pierre, how did you predict that was going to happen, and walk us through what exactly did happen with the printing of money?
Well, it's a very simple mathematical problem that we've known about for millennia, and it's the correlation between the growth in the money supply as a share of GDP and the cost of things. And if you look at Milton Friedman's amazing tomb, it's like a big brick of the monetary history of the United States. He puts in graphs of countries around the world, and he can show like a near perfect correlation between the growth in the money supply per unit of economic output and the inflation rate. And so what happens is you have the same number of goods and services, but more money chasing those goods and services, you get inflation. So what I saw happening in 2020, 2021, 2022 was that the central bank was buying government debt and effectively creating additional cash. And the result was that our money supply grew by about $500 billion or about 30%, during which time the real output of our economy actually declined. So you had a lot more money buying a lot less goods. And it stood to reason that that was going to result in inflation. All the central bankers, including Mark Carney, said, oh no, that's just simple thinking. Money printing doesn't cause inflation. Well, of course it did. And then we spent the last 2 years, our middle working class people spent the last 2 years suffering with this affliction. So the inflation is actually just the symptom. The real disease is overspending. Governments don't print money for fun. They print it so they can spend it. It's the sneakiest way to raise taxes without actually holding a vote. It'd be like, raising the GST 3 or 4 points. You'd get thrown out of office for that. But if you just tell the central bank to do a bunch of backroom hocus pocus that no one can understand, call it quantitative easing, you can sneak it under the radar. And that's what they did. And so what I'm saying is stop the spending that's driving the money printing. You need to cut bureaucracy, cut the consultants, cut foreign aid, cut back on corporate welfare, these checks we give corporations when they should be raising their own money through free enterprise. And then you don't have to print money, and you can protect the purchasing power of your dollar.
It's frustrating because Milton Friedman wrote that book probably, 60 or 70 years ago. We knew that this was going to happen. You were warning about it. And yet governments all over the world did it because everybody did it. There's inflation everywhere. And the Liberal government and Justin Trudeau can say it's a global phenomenon. Right. It has nothing to do with Canada. You got into some heat at the time by the legacy media for saying that you would fire the governor of the Bank of Canada, Tiff Macklem. Is that still your position? Or what else would you do to get money under control?
Well, there's a lot of things we need to do. First of all, let's start with this notion that it was a global phenomenon. It was only a global phenomenon in countries that did money printing. Switzerland did not. Switzerland is probably one of the most trade-dependent countries in the world. If the inflation was really the result of supply chains and just a contagion that was traveling everywhere because of COVID, well, then Switzerland would have had bad inflation, but they didn't. Why? Because they didn't create cash. They had small deficits, which they eliminated quickly, and they controlled their money supply. As a result, inflation never went up above 3.5%, and then it dropped below 2% almost immediately. Switzerland has really hard money. They have a lot of gold in their vault, and they do not create cash unnecessarily. And the Swiss have actually averaged inflation of 0.8% for the last 25 years, which means that in that period of time where we've been more like 2%, our money has lost value, 25% more of its value in purchasing power than theirs has. So what you need to do is be more like the Swiss. Control your money. Don't grow it faster than you grow the stuff that money buys. The other thing is that I'm not talking right now with the demand side. Well, there's also the supply side. If you have an economy with 10 apples and $10, it's $1 an apple. You double the number of dollars to 20, you still have 10 apples. Well, now it's $2 an apple. But if you do the opposite, which is to say you keep the $10, but you double the number of apples you grow to 20, now it's 50 cents an apple. So if we were to produce more energy, grow more food, build more homes, then we would actually reduce the cost of those things because there'd be a greater supply. The way you do that is unleash the free enterprise system. We should have fast permits for mining, pipelines, home building, and any other construction projects. We should cut taxes to reward production rather than raising them to punish it. That will unleash the production of the things that make our lives more high quality and gain purchasing power back for our people.
And so what specifically, though, would you do to make things more affordable? So, we want sound money. We want to stop printing money. But how would you kind of go back to the things that are already become really expensive, like groceries and gas? What would you do to?
Well, first of all, I think we need to get back to a monetary policy where the Bank of Canada does one thing, which is preserve purchasing power through price stability, not creating cash for governments to spend. Taxes are also a problem. We have these carbon taxes that go on fuel, which are then passed on through truckers to everything that you buy. If you got it, a truck brought it. And so if you tax the trucker's fuel, you're going to tax everything. By getting rid of that tax, you can bring down the shipping costs and the food costs, everything that you buy that requires energy. And there's a trick coming, a con job. Mark Carney has said that, he has this long history of supporting carbon taxes and pushing for them to be increased. He's going to pause the current carbon tax to get through the 2-month election. And then if God forbid, he wins, he'll bring back a much bigger tax with no rebate at all. And that will be devastating for our economy. So if you want an end to the carbon tax for good, for real, forever, then it's only the Conservatives that will deliver that.
So there's a funny clip of you, Pierre, sort of in the House of Commons with Justin Trudeau, and he was sort of bragging that his Liberal government had won 3 straight elections on the issue of the carbon tax. He said, if you're so confident, why don't you have a 4th? And at that point, we were sort of gearing up for an election based on this issue of carbon taxes. I think the Liberals are trying to neutralize it, to your point, at least on the surface, saying that they're going to walk away from the carbon tax too. So do you still think that we're heading to an election where the ballot box question will be about cost of living and the carbon tax?
I think it's even more important now. So let's talk about the carbon tax for a minute. There is no question Mark Carney will bring in a newer and bigger carbon tax. He said so. He said he's going to replace the current tax with a new tax that he wants to apply to Canadian industry. And when he was asked on CTV the other day, what if, for example, a steel company passes the price on to consumers? He said, well, when was the last time you needed steel for anything? You need steel for everything. I mean, this building is held up by steel. Automobiles are made of steel. Your pots and pans have all kinds of metallic value that will go up in price. Gym equipment, you name it, it's all got steel. And so he's going to tax the very industries that Trump wants to tariff. The other thing I would say is the Liberals are making this funny argument. They're saying, please forgive them for all the economic damage they did because we have to focus on the Trump tariffs. The economic damage Liberals did through taxes, debt, and blocking resource projects was bad before the tariffs. It's lethal after the tariffs. The fact that we're facing threats of these unjustified tariffs now is another reason we can't afford to take a risk on the radical tax and spend Carney-Trudeau Liberal policies that failed over the last 9 years.
Okay, because you mentioned tariffs, I'm going to ask you this question. When Trudeau said that they would issue retaliatory tariffs against the Americans, 25%, you came out in a basic agreement with that, saying that you would also support. So my question is, a tariff that Canada imposes is really just a 25% tax on the goods that we import. So it's a 25% tax on what Canadians pay for. So why is a Conservative leader agreeing with basically a 25% Liberal tax increase?
Well, I don't agree with any Liberal tax increase of any kind ever. But I do believe that if a foreign government attacks Canadian industry, that we have to retaliate. That is the only tool we have to deter. These tariff threats from the United States are utterly unjustified. There is no justification for what President Trump is threatening on Canada. They have their grievances about border and military. We have grievances with them about softwood lumber and Buy America. That doesn't justify a trade war. So what I've said is that whatever tariffs we collect on incoming American goods should be given directly to the affected industries, and whatever surplus is left over should be used for tax cuts. That would mitigate and try to neutralize the costs that Canadians would face from paying tariffs on incoming products. There's no question tariffs are taxes. That's why they're bad. But we have to defend our country and our industrial base if it comes under unfair and unprovoked attack by a foreign government, and cut other taxes to neutralize the effect of that unfortunate but necessary action.
You were up in Iqaluit earlier this week,
Yes.
announcing your Canada First plan with regards to increasing military spending.
Yes.
So would your goal be to raise Canada's military as a percentage of our GDP to 2%?
Yes, it is a goal. I will say, though, I've never believed in any part of the government that we should judge our success by how expensive we could be. Like, it's only in government that we have this funny formula where we say our program, my healthcare program has more billions than your healthcare program, therefore it must be the best healthcare program in the history of healthcare. And then you find out that, $1 billion was wasted on a contract to a sleazy consultant under the guise of this or that public policy objective. I would rather Yes, increase funding for the things we value, like healthcare and military, but I would rather judge our success by what we deliver. I would rather judge, for example, in healthcare, how much we shorten wait times, how much we improve, how many Canadians get an extra family doctor. On military, judge by how much territory we've protected by opening new base in the north, or by securing our waters with new icebreakers, or by delivering the best arms and kit to our soldiers, or the best quality of life to military families. That's how we should judge our success. You know, during the Afghan war, we probably did more pound for pound than any country save the US and possibly the UK, even though we were spending a lower share of our GDP on military than many of the European countries who parked themselves safely in Kabul, where the fighting wasn't happening. If you had gone to the Pentagon at the time and said, which would you rather have? Would you rather have Canadians who are actually tearing apart Al-Qaeda in Kandahar province, or would you, but spend 1%, 1.3% of GDP? Or would you rather have us spend 2% of GDP and park in Kabul and let someone else do the real fighting, like the other Europeans? I think that in 10 times out of 10, American generals at that time would have said, we would rather have you fighting on the front lines doing stuff. So let's measure government actions by what they achieve, not just by what they cost.
Well, I love your Afghanistan example, and people may know, I mean, the organization that we're launching is called Juno News. It's named after Juno Beach, the old beaches of Normandy. There were 5 beaches that were stormed that day. Right. The Canadians had 1, the Brits had 2, the Americans had 2, and the Canadians made the greatest gains that day. And so it is homage to the fact that Canadians punch above our weight militarily in the past, and that is a big part of our legacy.
We always have, and you know, I can hit 2%. I could hit 2% tomorrow if I were to do what Justin Trudeau did, which is have a gigantic boondoggle on the F-35s. You could blow billions of dollars on a boondoggle, and that would bring your defense spending up, but not your capabilities up. So I just once again say our focus should be, let's reduce the back office bureaucracy, the procurement boondoggles, and let's deliver more war-fighting capability for the best possible price to taxpayers and the highest quality of life for our men and women in uniform.
That's excellent. Okay, I want to talk a little bit about the election, the upcoming election, because I think a lot of Canadians were expecting it to happen in October 2025. Of course, NDP leader Jagmeet Singh said in December that he was going to pull the plug on Parliament as soon as it resumes. But here we are in this precarious situation where Parliament's been prorogued. We don't know who the next Prime Minister will be, presumably Mark Carney, but possibly Chrystia Freeland. So I guess I just want to know, when do you think the election will be, and are you ready for an election?
We are ready. I think it will happen quickly. I think Mr. Carney wants to avoid scrutiny. He wants to run during a honeymoon, and the legacy media to protect him from any kind of tough questions or scrutiny, whether it is about the advice he gave Trudeau that tanked our economy over the last 5 years, whether it is about him moving his company headquarters to New York only a few months ago, when that's exactly what President Trump wants, whether it's about him opposing Canadian pipelines while buying pipelines in the Middle East, or opposing Canadian energy while investing in American coal. Those are all highly hypocritical things that Mark Carney does not want explored. And so I think he'll want a quick election to avoid any scrutiny. I think it is important we do get a quick election, but let's not mistake the real reason why Carney wants that. It is to avoid any scrutiny and to have the Liberal establishment, the Liberal media, basically rubber stamp him as Prime Minister so that he can go on carrying out the same policies that have destroyed our economy, doubled our debt and housing costs after 9 years of the Liberals.
Well, you mentioned the legacy media, the Liberal media. Does it concern you going into an election that you've been outspoken? You said that you were going to defund the CBC. Mm-hmm. I believe that you said that you're going to remove the $600 million newspaper fund that Trudeau created to fund the legacy newspapers as well. Does that concern you that the media is just not going to give you a fair shake?
Well, the traditional mainstream media has always been totally liberal. I mean, there's a few exceptions, but by and large, they will just regurgitate whatever the Carney-Trudeau Liberals say. And in all of the last 6 or 7 elections, they have campaigned almost openly for the Liberals. So I would not expect it to be any different this time.
And so just to clarify, would you get rid of that $600 million newspaper fund that Trudeau gave to newspapers?
We are going to be cutting back on that. You'll have to wait for our platform to get the details.
Okay, because...
But we have to depoliticize news media finance, because right now what happens is that there are subsidies that go to favored media outlets that CRA designates, and then there's not funding for others. So, and then of course the worst example is CBC, which gets this enormous subsidy to do largely what Canadians can get elsewhere. Canadians can get digital media, videographical media, anywhere else, and yet they're paying $1 billion+ for CBC to do that. So I think those are examples of where we need to cut, and we need to defund the CBC and have an independent, self-supporting media that can keep Canadians informed.
Well, there is a growing ecosystem of independent creators, independent journalists, citizen journalists that you see popping up all over social media. And so I wonder, if you form government, the Parliamentary Press Gallery is like an insiders group. They don't want to give access to people who don't work for legacy media. What would your policy be around allowing access to your government or to you personally for independent media?
Absolutely. I think their independent media should be allowed on the precinct. There's no reason why it should be a small cabal of government-approved mouthpieces. It is highly undemocratic. I've always believed that. And it's made it particularly difficult for me because it means that only when I go and hold a press conference, it's just Liberal media who are there to attend. And but practically speaking, I'm in the precinct, I'm on Parliament Hill, I have to hold a press conference to get my message out. I would love to see a scenario where every different kind of journalist from all backgrounds, of all opinions, is given a chance to report on what happens on the Hill.
Well, because you know what happens, right? Like all these press galleries are like 50% CBC journalists.
Yes.
And they sort of set the tone. They set the priority. They get the questions. And so they're always pushing in one direction. Yeah. And it means, I mean, there's a huge opportunity. And this is why we launched Juno News, because so many Canadians just don't feel represented at all by the media and the questions they represent. It was 3 years ago that the Freedom Convoy was here in Ottawa, just right outside this building. And I think that was one of the things that they were saying, that the policy and the people in the city weren't representing what they believed. I wonder, like, what do you think the legacy of the Freedom Convoy was?
Well, I think that I supported those people who lawfully protested, because I believe that most of them just wanted their jobs back. The reason they were spending the time on Parliament Hill was just that they couldn't go back to work. And I think if the Prime Minister had gone out and talked to them, I actually think most of them would have gone on with their lives. But I think it was a very divisive and unfortunate approach that he took, name-calling, denouncing them, and treating them like they were not Canadians. And I think it's a good reminder that when a Prime Minister disagrees with a protest, he still has to remember that the people who are attending the protest are Canadians. They have the right to express themselves, and they deserve dignity and respect. And I think if that had happened, then it would not have dragged on so long. And I look at the Hamas riots that we're seeing in our streets, far more violent. We're seeing, fire bombings and bullets going into Jewish schools, and I think to myself, it was supposedly a national emergency, worthy of suspending civil liberties, that there were trucks parked in front of the Parliament building, but it's not an emergency when bullets are flying into children's schools or synagogues are being firebombed. And that is a very strange irony to me.
Well, I'm glad you brought up immigration. So you recently announced that people who are participating in those rallies, people who engage in violence and hate crimes, will lose their status. If they're here temporarily on a student visa or temporary visa, you would suspend the visa and deport them. So can you walk us through what that would look like?
Well, it's very simple. If you break our laws when you're here as a visitor, we kick you out. I don't know how anybody can disagree with that. If someone shows up in our country claiming to be a student or a temporary worker, and they start firebombing coffee shops, bakeries, synagogues, or any other place, then they need to be immediately arrested and they need to be deported. If someone is obviously a citizen, they should be prosecuted through our legal system and put in prison here in Canada for those sorts of crimes. But there's no excuse for keeping people in this country who are visitors here on a temporary visa or permit if they're breaking our laws.
What about people who are here illegally? What about people who have entered the country illegally or who have come to the country, applied for asylum claim, had that rejected, but remain in Canada? Would you deport those people?
Yes, I mean that's supposed to be the policy right now. I mean, if someone comes in, makes a false asylum claim, it gets rejected, they're supposed to leave today. The challenge that we're going to face is that under 9 years of the Carney-Trudeau Liberals' open border policies, we have now millions of people whose permits are going to expire over the next sort of 2 years. And if they don't leave, we have a very hard time, first of all, even knowing they're still here, finding them, and then carrying out a deportation. There are some among them that we do want to keep. They could be a master's graduate in computer engineering that has a 6-figure job in Kitchener-Waterloo, started a family, integrated, speaks the language. This is someone we want to keep. But we need to be able to make that decision ourselves through selection based on these criteria, not just by accident because people who are not eligible to stay decide they're not going to leave.
One of the other things that's happening in the States right now in the new administration is that President Trump has been serious about deportations. And a couple weeks ago, we had Secretary of State Marco Rubio saying that if he were the Canadians, he'd be concerned that a lot of the bad people there in the United States right now might try to sneak up into Canada. This happened last time Trump was president, Mr. Trump was president, where we had people crossing illegally through Roxham Road, thousands and thousands and thousands. And it was disgraceful. I went there myself, Pierre, and I couldn't believe it. You had CBSA officers acting like bellhops, lifting their suitcases, putting them into buses, taking them to Toronto or Montreal, their choice. They got to choose where they would go. So we were sort of facilitating illegal entry into our country. I believe Roxham Road has been closed, but I'm sure that happens in other places. I'm wondering, what would you do to stop bad people that are about to be deported from the United States from just walking across into Canada?
Well, they closed Roxham Road 30 days after I issued an ultimatum to Justin Trudeau that he had to close it, or that we would move a non-confidence. And so he actually met my ultimatum and closed it, which proved that what they had been saying before was all a lie. They claimed they had no way of closing it. Well, of course they had a way of closing it. They didn't want to. We're a nation with borders, and we have the ability to seal our borders against illegal crossers and to block people from coming in. And those that get onto our soil, what you need to do is just do a last in, first out refugee review of their claim. And this is how it works. If you're the last person into the country, then you immediately have your claim heard, which means that within a couple of weeks, if your claim is false, you're sent back. What that does is it sends the signal to everyone who might come in the future that they're going to be sent home automatically. The problem right now is that if someone gets in illegally, and even if they're not a real refugee, they're not fleeing danger, they have 7 or 8 years of appeals, during which we're paying for hotels and lawyers and food.
Healthcare above and beyond what Canadians get.
Above and beyond what Canadians get. So that then attracts more people to say, oh, hey, if I get to Canada, even though I'm not a real refugee, I can get into the country and I'll be bounced around in the system at someone else's expense forever. If we solve that problem, the message would go out very quickly that Canada is not a place you come to make a false or fraudulent claim. And I believe you would see a very real reduction in the number of people who even tried to come. I have a lot of sympathy for real refugees. My wife is a refugee. This has been a wonderful refuge for people who genuinely have claims, and that still will be the case when I'm Prime Minister. But we can't take in fraudulent fake claimants and pay their bills for 7 years while they work the system.
Okay, one more question on immigration. So Justin Trudeau and his government dramatically increased the number of legal permanent residents to Canada. So I think that average during the Harper years was about 250,000. 2025, we're up to 500,000. I think that there's, even Justin Trudeau himself admitted that they let in too many people too fast, and it had a wonky impact on housing market and everything else. Yes. What is your position on the right number in terms of the levels for permanent residency?
It would be a lot more like the Harper era numbers that were the same basically for 40 years before Trudeau took office, we were bringing in about 200,000, 250,000 a year in citizens, and we were more than able to house those numbers because we were building about the same number of homes as we were adding people. So we had a housing surplus at the time. What I would do is bring in a simple mathematical formula that says we cannot bring in people faster than we add houses. And you basically take home building in the prior year to set the population growth numbers in the next year. And you guarantee, in fact, I would actually make sure that we're building surpluses of housing into each of the next 4 years, because that's how we close the gap that is built up under Trudeau.
One of the other things we talk about a little bit is crime. I know that you talked about how you want to put life sentences on fentanyl dealers or the kingpins in the drug war. What about immigrants who are caught on drug charges? Do you think they should be deported?
When you say immigrants, you mean people who are citizens or permanent residents?
People who don't have their citizenship yet.
I don't think anyone here is here on a temporary visa of any kind who's caught breaking our laws should be allowed to stay. It's that simple. Okay. Any laws. Any other than a parking ticket, like if you come to Canada and you're caught selling, and you're not a citizen or permanent resident, you're selling drugs, you're doing violence, you're doing a fraud, a car theft, you got to go.
Well, one of the things you pointed out in a recent video that was talking about this fentanyl thing was that the Trudeau government, through Bill C-5, eliminated the mandatory minimums. And because there aren't minimum sentences for a lot of these crimes, you do end up having immigrants that get caught with like illegal guns or something like that, and they don't get deported because there's no minimum sentence. So would you put back those mandatory minimums?
Yes. Yeah. And to be clear, for people who are permanent residents and citizens, we're not going to obviously deport to permanent residents and citizens, but they will do very serious jail time under my new plan. So to put it into perspective, it takes only 2 milligrams of fentanyl to kill someone. There was a recent super lab that was busted in British Columbia about a month ago, and they had produced enough fentanyl or had enough fentanyl ingredients to kill 95 million people. That is to say, kill every Canadian more than twice. So these are large-scale mass murder operations. Fentanyl kills far more people than homicide. So when you are selling lots of fentanyl, you're like spraying bullets into a crowd. You might not know who you're killing, but you're killing someone. So you should go to jail for life. Anyone who's caught trafficking more than 40 milligrams will get a life sentence. Between 20 and 40 will be a 15-year sentence. Those will be mandatory minimums.
One of the remarkable things in a negative way that's happened recently is just the level of crime, specifically in the city of Toronto. Like, I can't tell you how many times, like, it's shocking to me that there are carjackings in Canada where gunned people will come and force you out of your car, even sometimes when there's kids in the car. Or so many people I talk to in Toronto are really worried about home invasions, people breaking into their house in the middle of the night. You had a police representative tell Canadians to just leave their keys near the front door, so if someone broke in, the thief could just take the car and they wouldn't bother you in the house. Like, what's happened in Canada? Like, how is this the case? What would you do to make Canadians feel safer and to get rid of a lot of this really heinous crime that's happening in Canada?
Well, these people have to go to jail. Like, the problem is right now, if you do a carjacking, you get arrested, you'll be back out on the street in a couple of hours. And Canadian police officers tell me they arrest the same offender often 3 times in the same day. And why? He's released on bail. The officer's not even done doing the paperwork on the arrest, and the offender's already back out on the street doing a new offense. So the good news is we actually don't have a lot of criminals in Canada. The bad news is they're extremely productive. They do a phenomenal amount of crime. And there's one guy in Penticton, his name is Levi. And the police tell me when he's out of jail, he does so much crime, the crime rate for the entire city of Penticton goes up. Like, you can say, you know, for this month, Levi was out of jail, and you can see a spike in crime. One guy, it's just insane. So what you need is not only mandatory prison for convicts, but you need to make it so that repeat offenders are ineligible for bail once they're arrested again. And that would automatically take, like, the 40 offenders in Vancouver got arrested 6,000 times. So imagine if they just stayed in jail. You'd have 6,000 fewer crimes. It's a very simple cause and effect. So jail, not bail, is one of our principles.
Well, I think that's a really good one. Okay, Pierre, thank you so much for your time. I really,
Thank
really
you.
appreciate it. We're going to wrap up the Candice Malcolm Show now, wrap up the YouTube and the X feed. We're going to continue the interview, though. I have one more question that I want to ask of Mr. Poilievre. It's a good question. So if you want to see the rest of this interview, please head on over to junonews.com. Subscribe. Our subscribers get all kinds of bonus features, including long-form interviews like this one. And again, please go over to junonews.com, subscribe, and then you'll see the rest of the interview there.